Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the annual HPRP Speaker Series. We are so excited to bring you this topic. This is our first time we are talking about economic justice in this series. And so we have an excellent presentation for you and an excellent panel. Each speaker will provide a critical perspective on the importance of a social safety net and making sure that it is both racially and economically inclusive and is mindful of economic justice. You will hear from those who engage in reform, not just in legal advocacy, but those who have used their own personal stories to shape the advocacy around this issue and demand transformational change at every level. My name is Kirsten Geddes Downs. I am the Executive Director of the Homeless Persons Representation Project, or HPRP. HPRP provides free, quality legal representation to Marylanders who cannot afford an attorney. Besides providing direct legal representation, we provide advocacy around matters of wrongful evictions, veterans benefits, records expungements. HPRP works very hard to change policies and programs that contribute both to homelessness, housing, and economic insecurity. Our direct representation informs our broader-based systemic advocacy and impacts litigation to address root causes of homelessness. Again, we have a great panel of speakers for you, and I will introduce them individually. But first, I'd like to introduce Ife Finch Floyd. Ms. Floyd is the Senior Economic Justice Policy Analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. This is a leading organization, and her work is an ongoing proactive examination of the social safety network and economic justice agenda. Before coming to GBPI, Ife was the director of TANF, Research and Analysis with the Family Income Support Division at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. During her decades at the center, she provided technical assistance to state partners, expanded engagement with TANF advocates, analyzed TANF data and policy, centering on racial inequities and the historical racism within the nation's cash assistance programs. Additionally, she built new partnerships with groups representing people with very low incomes and moved forward equity conversations within the organization. Ife holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Northwestern University and a master's of public policy from Georgia State University. Welcome, Ife.
Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you so much to HPRP for inviting me to this conversation today. I do have slides. I feel I'm somebody who loves slides, so I'm going to get those set up. Just one moment. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And as was great, thank you. And as was mentioned before I came to the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, I worked at the national level at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and focused a lot of my work on temporary assistance for needy families. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the history of cash assistance programs in the country and their relationship to racist narratives and policies. And hopefully this presentation could provide some foundation and inform some of the later conversation that we're going to have this evening. Before I left the Center on Budget, I led the work and co-authored a series of papers looking at this history, and we can certainly share those links for more detail. There's, I believe, 5 papers in the series, but if you want to just read one, the first one, which kind of includes a lot of the different components that the subsequent papers include, kind of all in one piece, I encourage you to read it. It is it is long, but there is a lot of history to cover. So we just wanted to make sure that we were giving it its full due. I am going to try to keep to my time, so I'll try to keep my remarks brief. But first, I wanted to offer a little bit of high-level summary of what Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, is. So first off, it is the monthly cash assistance program that we have for families with children who are experiencing poverty. And generally, benefits are very low. There are strict work requirements. There is a 60-month federal time limit, although some states have shorter time limits. And there is a fixed amount of federal funding to TANF, to states for TANF, and that's called a block grant. States are also required to contribute some of their spending towards TANF as well, and that is called the maintenance of effort. But if you look from state to state, each TANF program looks different because states have such broad discretion in how they construct their programs. But really what we've seen nationally is that TANF really has not adjusted to need over time, to the number of families experiencing poverty since its creation in '96. And the Center on Budget created this measure called the TANF to poverty ratio that looks at the number of total families on the program, and compared that to every 100 families living in poverty. Some people, want to say that's a percentage. For technical reasons, we call it a ratio, but you get the idea. And in 1996, that ratio was 68. So 68 families receiving TANF or cash benefits for every 100 in poverty. And today, nationally, that number is 21. And we see this decline in the reach of TANF program across all states. And in Maryland, in 2020, I believe that ratio was 29 families for every 100 in poverty. So we argue in this paper, and the Center on Budget argues in a lot of its work, that it really is these policy choices and these racist policy choices that have made TANF, quite frankly, a very weak safety net support for families. And this is due because of what I'm calling this conditional deservingness of TANF. In the paper series, we break down certain policies and narratives into 3 key buckets. Now there may be different buckets that other people come up with. Some of these buckets are intersectional, but this is just how we started to think about it. So the first bucket is economic control. Then we have reproductive control and behavioral control. And we look at the history of cash assistance and TANF in this paper series, again, through the lens of the experiences of Black women and the narratives about Black women that have justified some of these policies. So let's start with economic control. The narrative is that people will not work if we give them cash aid. And we heard this loud and clear in the conversation around the child tax credit at the federal level. And so the policy then, therefore, is establishing work requirements, which TANF has. And then reproductive control measures. Again, this narrative is that people are having children to get assistance. And in TANF, one example of that, of a policy representing that, is family caps. Maryland doesn't have a family cap. I believe 11 other states do. Georgia is one of them. And what it is that if a family is already receiving cash benefits and they have another child, they are not going to get that increased benefit for having a larger family. And the reasoning behind that is because there was this idea that people were having babies, whole humans, for a very marginal increase in cash benefits. And then we have behavioral control, very much related to reproductive control. The narrative is around parents being irresponsible or even criminal in some cases. So we have policies like across different states, again, like a drug selling ban. So folks who have a drug felony on their record but are returning to society, they may be ineligible for TANF and perhaps some other benefits. There's drug testing in some states. There's EBT restrictions. So EBT card is a debit card that families receive benefits. And they may not be able to use that in certain places, like liquor stores. Then of course, there's time limits. So in our paper series, we argue that these narratives, well, we don't argue, we state and present as fact that these narratives are a part of the reproductive economic behavioral control of that enslavement started for Black women and Black people largely. And there were these narratives to justify enslavement. And these are the narratives that we still see today in caste assistance. So I'm just going to name a few of these narratives, and there are more, I'm sure, but these are the ones that stand out for me, again, that tie very closely to some of the policies and rhetoric around caste assistance programs throughout the 20th century. So first we have the Jezebel, or the immoral mother. This stereotype is a hypersexualized Black woman, and was used to justify the sexual abuse of Black women by white men. And then we have the mammy, or the negligent mother. So this is kind of an interesting, two sides of the same image, right? On one side, the mammy is the ideal Black woman in her role as a mother figure, devoted to her master's white children or her employer's white children, is docile, but at the same time, she's negligent of her own children who she has to leave in order to work, right? So she's irresponsible at the same time. And then we have the coon. The coon is often depicted as a man in a lot of the imagery, but I believe the ideas associated with the coon can be applied to Black people generally. The coon is seen as lazy, as slow, it's not so bright, but is also conniving at the same time, trying to take advantage of the master or of white people. And so, you know what, let me pause. I've been saying the word narrative and I didn't actually define it. So when I speak of narratives, I'm talking about a collection of stories, of images, of ideas about a certain issue or people that present as facts about that specific issue or around that group of people. And these, it could be like a stereotype, but a stereotype is not necessarily the whole narrative, right? It is part of a story that contributes to a larger narrative. So we see these images that were used to justify enslavement also used in a larger narrative around caste assistance, and that is the welfare queen. And a lot of people are familiar with that idea and that image because we hear about the welfare queen who in reality was Linda Taylor, who was a con artist, so a mixed race woman who took advantage and made up husbands and children in order to collect public benefits. But as Reagan popularized this concept, he began to apply this welfare queen notion to people who were living in urban public housing in the slums, right? Clearly referring to Black and brown people who lived in urban areas, talking about people who were having all these children who did not want to work. All of these pieces are kind of these components of these images that were born out of enslavement and attached to Black women and Black families generally. So we're going to see how this manifested in caste assistance historically. So let's start again with economic control. And here are some of the messages. There's not going to be anybody left to roll these wheelbarrows and press these shirts. And this is Congressman Philip Landrum of Georgia in 1969. And he actually wasn't talking about caste assistance or aid to families with dependent children, as it was called then, specifically, but he was referring to President Nixon's plan, the Family Assistance Plan, which was actually a basic income plan, which would have replaced AFDC, or aid to families with dependent children. But again, using kind of this narrative of lazy Black women who are not going to press these shirts if they were to get a basic income. And more recently, Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, people in Wisconsin expect people to work. Maybe it's the old Germanic heritage, the old European heritage. Again, insinuating that it's white culture that is only hardworking. Let me just be very clear. People work regardless of their race. And if they're not working, they're working for legitimate reasons. They're either caring for family members or friends. They may even have a work-limiting disability or other circumstances that prevent them from working. And there is also data that shows that Black women have always had higher employment rates than white women throughout the 20th century and 21st century. So let's just be very clear about work and Black women. So a couple of strategies used for policies that were used to push people towards low wage work. One was low benefits. From the very beginning of AFDC, was initially called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This started during the Social Security Act negotiation, which created ADC in 1935. And during those negotiations, Southern Democratic legislators were adamant that there should be no federal standards on benefits, in that states and localities, as they had under previous state-specific cash programs, should have control over determining benefits. But they were also very clear that they did not want those benefits to compete with the local labor market, which was based on Black workers and white tenant farmers. They wanted to make sure that those low-wage workers continued to be available. And as AFDC continued on through the 20th century, there consistently were low benefits throughout the country, but in particular, states with high levels of, or high concentrations of Black people living in the state, or high concentrations of Black people receiving AFDC, those states tended to have lower average benefits than states with lower Black populations. And research showed this is regardless of political ideology of the state, or ideological leanings of a state. There were also farm policies, employable mother policies that basically cut benefits off in order for Black families to work. They targeted Black families in particular. So, for example, for farm policies, Louisiana denied assistance during cotton picking season to make sure that Black people were in the fields. Georgia had an employable mother policy in that anyone receiving earnings could not also receive benefits. Reproductive control, the reproductive control theme. Here was the message. The Black woman, because of child welfare assistance, is making it a business, in some cases, of giving birth to illegitimate children. This is from Mississippi State Rep. David Glass in 1958. So there were proposals in the 50s, and more so in the 60s, to sterilize AFDC recipients. In 1964, Mississippi proposed a bill to sterilize people who had children outside of marriage, because the thinking was that these illegitimate children were causing the rolls to increase. There were also birth control proposals. These were all proposals, by the way. None of them were passed, thank goodness. But there were also birth control proposals for AFDC recipients. And in '93, Maryland's governor, William Donald Schaefer, wanted to mandate long-acting birth control for AFDC recipients. Again, it didn't pass, but again, this idea that women are having babies to get assistance. And then behavioral control. This next quote is kind of, again, talking about that irresponsibility. The parents are so irresponsible that they're unwilling to come to work or go to school. What makes you think that they're taking the added welfare dollars and spending them responsibly on their kids? New Jersey Assemblyman Wayne Bryant, who represented Camden, New Jersey, and had a large Black population that was using public benefits. The suitable home policies extended back into the early 20th century, and they were initially meant to protect children from maltreatment and neglect. But there was also this moral component. So a lot of caseworkers would go in and kind of determine whether a person got aid based on if the home was morally fit. And this took on a new tenor in the mid-century as the cash assistance caseload began to diversify. They was no longer serving predominantly white widows. They moved off the rolls to get, because they were now eligible for the expanded Social Security benefits. So now there was more Black women on the rolls. There was more mothers who were divorced, mothers who were unwed on the rolls. And so as one Georgia policymaker said, we need to clean up the rolls. And so we see this proliferation of suitable home policies. The most punitive were in states with high Black populations. So let me give you an example of what some of these look like. In Florida, the Florida legislature equated an unsuitable home as one where there was a presence of a child born outside of wedlock or promiscuous conduct, and equated that to child maltreatment and threatened to take children away. They targeted Black families, and a lot of Black families left the rolls as a result. In Louisiana, in the early 1960s, they had the most broadest definition of unsuitable home to date. And they deemed a home unsuitable if a family had a child who was born outside of marriage, and even if parents were a part of a common law marriage, which is very typical of Black families. This law cut off 6,000 families. 95% of those children were Black, and they were cut off within 3 months of implementation. So as our team was thinking about policies to move TANF forward in an anti-racist way, we wanted to make sure that those policies were not reinforcing these racist narratives of TANF and of prior cash assistance programs, but instead we're focusing on learning from the experiences of Black women who were accessing public benefits or trying to access public benefits, and thinking about how do we make sure that they have the supports they need to maintain their families. So first, we started with establishing a minimum federal benefit so that no family falls below a certain level, so some minimum floor, ending all mandatory work requirements at the state and national level, barring behavioral requirements, time limits, or other eligibility exclusions, and then also not mandating, but offering services that put the family first, so the family can start with their goals and working with a coach or a case manager or some community partner to think about what supports they need to reach long-term well-being. So that was a lot. I'm going to pause there and start for quick questions.
Sorry. Thank you, Ife. That was a very informative overview of the history and where we are trying.
Kristen, I can't hear you anymore.
Learning from the experience of Black women. Can you describe that framework and how it is useful in providing a more equitable system for everyone?
Okay, I missed the first part of the question, but I believe it was around the Black Women's Best Framework. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the question. One part that I left off in the beginning about this paper series is that, yes, as you could probably tell, we did focus on Black women, and we used a framework created by Janelle Jones, who's now at the Department of Labor as a chief economist, called the Black Women's Best Framework. And what it basically says is that when you center the needs of Black women and their families who have been closest to harm, closest to, the exploitation and the oppression of our economic and social systems, and you tailor policies that support them and their families, you're also creating policies that work better for everyone. And this is an example of targeted universalism. And some people, another example of targeted universalism is the cuts in the sidewalk, right? So those ramps for people with wheelchairs to go up on the sidewalk more easily. When those were created, they were created for people with disabilities, but as it turns out, they're actually beneficial for a lot of folks, people who are using strollers or pushing something down the street, or if you have a kid learning how to ride their bike, right? Those cuts in the sidewalk, which were for a targeted population, they actually benefit everyone. So if we think about, changing cash assistance policy, for example, to focus on, having decent level of benefits, focusing on, trusting parents, right? Because this was all built around not trusting parents and specifically not trusting Black women. But if you focus, cash assistance policy, now I'll speak about cash assistance policy broadly, even when we're thinking about broad-based cash programs like child tax credit or GBI, when you focus on that trust, that is inherently anti-racist because there has been so much distrust when it comes to Black people and certainly people of color generally when it comes to cash and when it comes to them making the best decisions for themselves. But we know, as the child tax credit, for example, that gave people with kids unrestricted cash. What did they use it on? They used it on the basic needs, the essentials, and child poverty went down, right? So thinking about those kind of anti-racist policies and those that are specifically focused on Black women, they're certainly going to help Black women, but they're also going to help everyone as well.
Thank you. You also touched on the issues of reproductive control. Right now, we are in a, unfortunately, much needed dialogue about reproductive rights. But do you believe that there should be a more extensive discussion about reproductive health, and particularly how these policies play out and their effect on particularly women of color?
Yes, absolutely. People who are in the reproductive justice movement, this is broader than the reproductive rights movement, but folks like Loretta Ross, right, who coined the term reproductive justice. These are Black and brown women in the 90s who were saying, we need to think more broadly than just an abortion, not abortion rights conversation. Because for women of color, even if we have abortion on the books, we can't, they can't always get abortions, either because of money, not having transportation, et cetera, right? And then if we decide to have children, we don't always have the supports to have children, right? So there's this whole kind of economic component, right, to being able to make the best economic decisions for yourself, reproductive decisions for yourself, right? So, sorry, I'm pulling my thoughts together. So what I have learned from this research is how much cash assistance, as an example, played in trying to control women's reproductive lives and birthing people's reproductive lives, right? They were denying assistance for people with kids. They were saying, if your family structure doesn't look like this idealized version of the family, you don't get cash. And then went even so far as to propose policies to try to limit women and birthing people's reproductive capabilities in the first place, right? Taking away that decision from them, right? and taking away that control. So there's this whole arc that goes back, is part of the history of this country for women, and especially Black women and birthing people, that has been connected to our economic system. I think you can look at low-wage work in the same way, in that it's not set up for people who are pregnant, right? Or not having paid leave. There are a whole constellation of policies that are around and would support women and birthing people in their reproductive decisions. And I think, and their economic and social policies. And I think while this is a critical moment to focus on reproductive health care, absolutely, that is only one component of this larger conversation. And I would love for people to continue to bring in this, the economic realities that women with low income, women who are experiencing, different challenges, women who are fleeing domestic violence, for example, or people who are fleeing domestic violence, right? The economic challenges there, and and being able to make decisions about your own reproductive decisions. Like all of our lives are intersectional. And that is what this research taught me, in addition to how bad cash assistance policy has been in our country, right? It only goes to show that this is not just a rights conversation. This is a larger conversation about having the resources and supports for people to make the best decisions for themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to bring our panelists into this discussion. I think this overview gives a great foundation for how our panelists have been interacting with this subject, both personally and professionally. So I'd like to introduce them and have them lend their voices to this dialogue. So let me introduce our other panelists that can lend to this amazing knowledge that Ife has shared with us. First, I'd like to introduce Charnel Covert. Charnel is an educator, activist, and community organizer, minister, and healer. Charnel currently works as a community educator for the House of Ruth Maryland, one of the leading organizations against intimate partner violence in families and communities. A seasoned educator, she is currently faculty in the Women and Gender Studies Department at Towson State University. She uses liberation and creative pedagogy that challenges her students to become servant leaders in their spheres of influence. Erica Young is a mother, a community advocate, and photographer. Over the past 3 years, Erica advocated in support of legislation that passed before the Maryland General Assembly to strengthen the Temporary Cash Assistance Program, which is Maryland's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or TANF. Michelle Medeo. Michelle is the director of the Economic Justice Project of the Homeless Persons Representation Project, where she engages in advocacy, direct representation, and education to expand economic and racial justice. Michelle works with Marylanders experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity to bring about system reform. Before joining HPRP, Michelle worked as a clinical law fellow with the University of Maryland Carey School of Law's International Human Rights Clinic and the Healthcare Delivery Clinic. Michelle holds a JD from the University of Maryland School of Law and a BA from American University. Michael Camlin, is the program specialist for the Criminal Justice and Juvenile Justice Program and the Addiction and Health Equity Program at the Open Society Institute Baltimore, or OSI Baltimore. Before joining OSI, Mr. Camlin served in the Peace Corps, first in Ukraine as the Youth Development Coordinator, and then in Malawi as the technical advisor to the local government on health systems strengthening for HIV/AIDS services. Previously, Michael worked as a case manager for youth and adults with mental health and substance abuse disorders. He has a community organizing in low-income Baltimore neighborhoods and worked in higher education administration and development. Michael is passionate about human rights and social justice and committed to addressing the structural issues that link drug policy to the criminal justice system. Michael holds a MSW in Community Action and Social Policy from the University of Maryland and a BA in Psychology and Brain Science and Philosophy from Johns Hopkins University. So welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask a few questions of each of you, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for the audience to join in with their questions as well. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with you, Erica. What problems did you see existing in the Maryland social service system?
Well, there are actually a variety of problems that exist within the Maryland social services system, especially in regards to economic benefits. Now, here in Maryland, the TANF program is TCA, that's temporary cash assistance. And in order to be eligible for TCA, a parent either has to have an underage child, be pregnant, or be a caretaker, which is usually taking care of someone that's disabled. And according to DHS, that's the Department of Human Services, that's the entity that runs this program, the temporary cash assistance purpose is to provide, quote, provide cash assistance for families when available resources do not fully address the family's need while preparing participants for independence through work. Now, there are a few eligibility guidelines in order to receive cash benefits, but I'd like to focus on the work activity aspect. In order to meet the requirements of work activity, a person that's receiving these cash benefits that are able-bodied adults must participate in usually unpaid work experience for 20 to 30 hours per week. Now, these assignments are usually 90-day cases. Now, think about that. In order for me to get assistance, cash assistance, this is a family, the adult has to work 20 to 30 hours per week for a 90-day period. Now, the average TCA recipient, a family of 3, I believe, is about $750 a month. So if you equate that, in order for me to receive $750 a month, they're actually doing unpaid work for 20 to 30 hours per week. That's nearly a part-time or full-time job nearly for a period of 3 months, which is really, really ridiculous. There are hundreds of Maryland employers that benefit from this free labor. That's hotels, fast food, hospitals, churches, schools, even government and state agencies themselves. So the Maryland economy in many ways depends on this free labor. And unfortunately, for the people that are receiving these benefits, that usually ends them in a cycle of unsuccessful assignments because their personal needs, goals, and interests aren't considered when they're being placed in these job activities. Now, according to, this is DHS own information, this is public information, less than 1% of these employers who use their free labor actually hire those same workers. So for a period of 3 months, you were able to complete the job successfully, do it as mandated, but that's not good enough to actually hire the person. Now, we know that these businesses are, of course, they're receiving subsidies, but they're not actually paying anything out of their pocket. Now, that's almost, like I said, a full-time employee for a matter of 3 months. Can you imagine how much money is being saved by these employers to hire these the participants in the TCA program? Now, the University of Maryland School of Social Work publishes an annual report on the TCA program. Now, this is their findings that after 1 year after benefits ended, 56% of these household parents found employment, and that the median income of those who were at once unpaid workers was $4,500 annually. $4,500 annually. Talk about perpetuating poverty. And if I'm not mistaken, that's probably nearly a third of the federal guidelines for poverty. So not only did you not bring me out of poverty or help me during my hardship, you actually probably pushed me further into poverty and perpetuating that same cycle. And remember that the purpose of the program was to prepare participants for independence through work. So essentially, I'm doing all this work, but I'm not benefiting from it myself. It's not helping my family. And like I said, for those recipients, there's also the additional burden of very stringent guidelines.
Right.
And there's, the risk of losing my benefit if I don't complete this 20 to 30 hours at whatever this placement is. It could be a placement washing dishes. What is the benefit of that? Is there really growth in these places where you are assigning me to do these work activities? And there's also not much variety in the selection of job activity types. And often, like I said, these options don't offer a livable income and not much space for growth.
Mhm.
And like I said, this whole idea that people that receive cash assistance are lazy. They don't like work. And another thing to note, that many people that do receive TCA are actually employed, but underemployed.
Mhm.
So they're actually looking for an opportunity to learn more things in order to gain better employment, in order to push their family out of poverty. So those issues with work activity is definitely a major problem within the system here in Maryland.
So in your advocacy work, what solutions were you able to advocate for in order to at least try to transform the system to be more equitable?
There's a few. I'll speak on the House Bill 1043, which is just passed this last 2022 legislative session, which I believe goes into effect in October. And it offers some relief. It gives parents the choice of working 20 to 30 hours, but places a limitation on how many assignments that they can be assigned to, work assignments, unpaid work assignments that they could be assigned to. And it also allows the participant to change their work activity if it doesn't suit what their goals and aspects for themselves are. So this is done in order to, if a participant is going into a field that they're actually interested in, the increased chance of success is stupendous, because nothing is going to hamper you more than being forced into something where I said has no growth. There's not much, the income isn't increased, and it's something I'm not interested in. So then it's not a career, it's a job.
Mhm.
And that, again, once you get tired of a job or the job doesn't fit whatever guidelines the individual needs, they're going to need assistance again, which, like I said, perpetuates their poverty. So House Bill 1043 definitely addressed that in order to give participants more marketable skills for themselves.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your advocacy. I think that, the recent bills have definitely made a difference. And we hope that people will comply. I'm going to move to Michelle because I know that your work has also been advocating on these bills. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been going on in Maryland and maybe some of the wins that Erica was talking about?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we had some very exciting wins this session, and by we, no one does this work alone, so I'm referring to advocates with lived experience who, provided, we've had a work group for over a year meeting and provided a lot of very rich policy recommendations and shared experiences, and just really unveiled the inequities in the operation of the work program in Maryland. And so, I can start with House Bill 1041. I'm sorry, House Bill 1043, which Erica just mentioned. So this really tries to place a lot of restrictions on when the agency in Maryland, the Department of Human Services, can require folks to do the unpaid work program. I think I'll just say that, we would love to just abolish the work program altogether. So that is something hopefully we can look at through federal advocacy, but we tried to look at Maryland's TCA program and see within the very broad, as Ife mentioned, the very broad framework provided to states, like what is the most that Maryland can do. And there's still more work to be done. But what the bill does is requires the department to ask a series of questions to parents before making a referral to the work program, and to center the parents' desires and wishes and offer a series of choices. So before the department can just refer someone to these unpaid work assignments, they have to offer at least 3 choices, only one of which can be unpaid work. There's all these other programs out there, hopefully, that the department can look at. Other states are using paid employment or subsidized employment, which has better short-term outcomes associated with them. There's school, education, other training programs. So trying to avoid unpaid work as the main source and requirement. And so also recognizing that not everybody is immediately going to be able to do the work program. So looking at what kinds of exemptions can be in place. So first 6 months in receiving TCA, if a parent wants to be exempt from the work program, that would be their choice. If a parent is wanting to be home with a newborn under the age of 1, that would be their choice. And we know anyone who knows, who has had an infant or knows someone, that is work, a lot of work. And so allowing the parent the choice to be able to focus on doing that, as opposed to immediately finding childcare provider for a newborn and rushing off to do this unpaid work. Erica mentioned, folks were doing 20 to 30 hours a week. That is what the federal law considers to be engaged in work. But in Maryland, and so the House Bill 1043 recognizes that those federal minimums are okay. It's really pathetic. We needed legislation to say that in Maryland, but what was happening was the department was referring everyone to work for 40 hours a week. So you had a parent who wanted to be at the bus stop when their kid got off the bus so they could accompany them to the home and help with homework. And the agency was just saying, nope, unless you're at work until 4:30. And then of course you have to get on public transportation and get home, your cash assistance will be cut. So I think, the more we have heard from folks through, at HPRP, I've been there 9 years and have represented folks in direct, representation in cases, and we would continue to win over and over in these administrative hearings, and the agency would still do the same thing. And, even though the agency was part of our work group and heard all of the really brilliant recommendations from parents with lived experience with the program, they were not, unfortunately making the changes necessary. So we needed the legislation. So really just centering the parent's choice in the work activity, like Erica said, allowing a parent, if it's not aligning with their career or family goals or both, letting the parent switch to a new program, not being forced into these assignments where they have no input. That was another thing that really came out of a lot of the discussions in the work group, was parents really feeling that the kind of conversation and the policies and all communication with the agency just feels very oppressive, that there's no, folks are not wanting at the department are not really wanting to hear what the parent believes is best for them, for themselves, for their career, for their family. So, the legislation really spells out a process that the department must follow before it can require folks to do these unpaid work assignments. And then there was another bill, House Bill 1041, which is going to have a outside independent agents or independent contractor do a kind of a thorough analysis of Maryland's temporary cash assistance program through an anti-racist and trauma-informed lens, and to make recommendations of how to make the program more equitable. And also looking at the vendor contracts, so looking at who the department is contracting out these work programs with, and why the outcomes aren't equitable, why families don't have the economic mobility that we'd like to see.
Thank you. Chanel, when listening to the information we're receiving, these programs are, as Ife, Erica, and Michelle have indicated, based on racist stereotypes. And without listening to the narratives of those who need to participate in these programs, it seems that transformational change would be out of reach. What challenges do you feel people of color, queer, disabled individuals face when they are encountering the system and are unable to have their narratives recognized and honored?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you so much to my wonderful panelists. It's such an honor to be with you all. I really appreciate Ife's broad historical context for what this system is. And so thinking about the narratives of folks who have historically been oppressed, such as Black, Indigenous people of color, queer folks, differently able and disabled folks, there's a number of things that take place, and even young people who are trying to assess the temporary cash assistance system. I do want to start by just articulating that these systems are anchored in systemic racism and overt capitalism, deep classism, bias, homophobia, and queerphobia. And so when we think about where the context of these systems come from, thinking about the foundations of chattel slavery through the social safety net and welfare, the way in which, as Ife mentioned, with the articulation of stereotypes of Black women in particular, who are seen as welfare queens in the Reagan era, but also the way in which folks are valued or undervalued when they check any one of intersectional boxes. And so for looking at Black, Indigenous people of color, you have a lot of folks who are coming into these systems having low literacy and having low literacy for any number of reasons. That could be because of the poor educational systems that are existing in our communities, right? When we talk about the intersections of all these problems, none of them exist in a vacuum. And so if someone is coming in needing to do the application online, low literacy can also be low literacy with technology. Most of the systems currently require folks to receive any sort of benefit through some sort of online portal. If you, one, don't have access to technology or internet, high-speed internet in a certain way in your home or even in your library, at your children's school, that disqualifies you in many ways from even being able to get the benefit. We even saw during COVID in particular, when all of the social service agencies were shut down, that you had to rely solely on the online portal. And so for folks who are not familiar, who've been in the technological divide, which is a huge racist and classist system that's been set up predominantly against working class and poor Black and brown folks, who don't have access to broadband and Wi-Fi in the same way that others do. So if I can't get the benefit in and of itself because I can't apply, that automatically knocks me out of the running. What if I'm able to, let's say, use my phone? In some cases, the portals don't even, I've heard from working with folks and advocating with folks, portals don't work properly on the phone in the same way they do on a computer. If I don't have access to a laptop, again, that's a challenge. Another issue that comes up is that when folks are differently able or disabled, thinking about things like autism and ADHD and any number of learning disabilities or developmental disabilities, if I'm unable to articulate to my case manager that I'm having issues with the system in some way, that I didn't receive my TCA benefit for the month, that it was the wrong amount, that it did not come onto my EBT card, that I was not eligible, or I didn't realize that I was eligible for something called TDAP, which is a similar program, the temporary disability assistance program for individuals who are unable to work because of their disabilities. We see a lot of folks who actually are applying for TCA when they should be applying for TDAP and don't know the difference. And so when they're speaking to case managers and trying to get that advocacy, case managers being very dismissive. Why? Because case managers are part and parcel of a system that underpays them. They feel overworked and overburdened, and they are also recipients of larger systems of structural violence. So we're seeing a huge amount of low-level caseworkers who are people of color coming from working class communities being disgruntled by the fact of, why do I have to work this terrible job getting paid a very little bit amount of money, giving you access to benefits, the person on the other end. And so I'm not going to give you that resource. I'm not going to give you that assistance that you need. We know because of ADA that there are certain accommodations that folks with different with disabilities are qualified legally to receive, but in many cases are not receiving from those case managers and or supervisors. And then when thinking about the inherent homophobia and queerphobia that exists in our culture overall, thinking about same-sex couples or folks who are living together, having to find creative ways to state that their domestic partners or husbands or wives in same-sex partnerships are actually in the home, would rather not say that because it might interfere with the benefit. So there's all these issues, and not to mention the historical way that Black men have been pushed out of the home in relationship to the welfare system overall, and ways that the Black family has been disseminated or broken down in order to keep these menial benefits. And just keeping in mind, as Erica mentioned, we're talking a few $100s for families. We're not talking thousands. We're not talking multiple thousands. We're talking at most 700 or more or less dollars, right? I also want to just bring up the process of humiliation and degradation that takes place for recipients. I think this doesn't get talked about enough. In addition to the large stereotypes that only Black and brown folks receive welfare, when we know that large in part, the majority of recipients of public assistance are actually white individuals. Besides that fact, the way that folks feel when they go into social service offices and how they're being talked to as if they are subhuman and not human at all, that cuts across every barrier and every point of identity, whether that is a queer person, a person of color, a disabled person, etc. And then one thing I want to say as well is that I think that there is a space for us to begin to think about how can community-based organizations and faith-based institutions in particular be safe spaces to help recipients of public assistance have other alternatives, because we know that these benefits are not enough to sustain and create the type of safety net that working class families need. And so having programs, some of the programs that we used to have in community, job readiness programs and education programs at local community centers and churches and mosques, are really imperative, in addition to having someone to walk you through what can be a cumbersome application process if you're not familiar with it. So I know I said a lot, but hopefully that gives some indication of those pieces.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to take it over to Michael to kind of continue that train of thought. Michael, how can funders be more responsive and promote accountability? And particularly, as Charnel brought up, the need for community organizations to be empowered in order to provide the support in their own communities.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for having me here. I think there are a number of ways that funders can work to equitably strengthen the social safety net, both in terms of the external work that foundations choose to fund and more internal considerations around the way they go about doing that funding. So I'll talk a little bit about both. So first off, there's a lot that foundations can do in terms of their own practices to help equitably strengthen the social safety net. And I'm going to kind of talk about the safety net a bit more broadly, kind of as Charnel was indicating, focusing not just on the public safety net, but also on community resources that help to fit gaps not met by public services. So private foundations provide a significant amount of the funding that supports local nonprofits and community organizations who are providing social services. So what we choose to fund impacts the resources available in communities and the types of organizations that are able to sustainably grow and contribute to the broader safety net. And what we see is that all too often, philanthropy is basically white people giving money to other white people. We need to change that, both by changing the type and range of organizations we're funding, and by changing who we're empowering within foundations to make decisions about where money should be directed. As Ife shared with us, there's a long history of structural racism and discrimination that's led us to where we are today in Baltimore and elsewhere across the country. And Black, Brown, and Indigenous-led nonprofits continue to be greatly underfunded within the nonprofit community. The great majority of both public and private philanthropic dollars go to white-led institutions, even here in Baltimore, where almost 2/3 of the city is Black. But that doesn't make sense because we know that those who are most impacted have the best understanding of the issues and are best positioned to develop solutions to address those issues. So if we're seeking to address racial inequities, we should be funding organizations that are led by and serving communities of color. Similarly, if we're seeking to address inequities experienced by people with disabilities, we should be supporting organizations led by and serving people with disabilities. Wherever there's a group that's being left behind by our safety net, we should be looking to use philanthropic dollars to support their leadership on addressing those gaps. Philanthropies also need to look at their staffing in terms of who they're hiring and promoting, and they need to be more intentional about hiring and promoting people of color, LGBTQIA+ people, people with disabilities, and other directly impacted people to be actually in control of philanthropic dollars so that less private money is controlled by people who look like me. Along those lines, beyond just funding impacted groups, we should be involving impacted communities in our decision-making processes around how we make grants and which groups we decide to fund. Because philanthropy has the power to shape community resources, the community should be at the table to help direct where those resources go. As one example of how we're trying to shift the way that local philanthropies do business, we have an initiative called Be More Invested, where we created a pooled fund in partnership with a dozen other local foundations to support people of color-led organizations that are working to create safety and well-being in communities across Baltimore. And instead of just having funders decide who to fund, we created a selection committee that had a 2-to-1 ratio of community representatives to philanthropic staff, so that the real decision-making power over where our private dollars went rested with the community. As a result, we resourced a really impressive array of community-based organizations, many of which hadn't previously been on the radar of lots of the funders at the table. By working in partnership with trusted community leaders, we learned about all these great organizations working to equitably strengthen the social safety net for communities of color in Baltimore that might otherwise have gone unsupported. And in addition to working with community members and other foundations, there's also a role that philanthropy can play by working with government, helping to fill in gaps in public services so that fewer people fall through the cracks of our safety net. As an example of how we at OSI have partnered with local government, in response to the pandemic, we worked with the Mayor's Office of Employment Development and the City Health Department to support the Baltimore Health Corps, which trained and employed hundreds of city residents as COVID contact tracers and public health outreach workers. We also worked with the City Health Department to develop a public messaging campaign about COVID vaccinations and identify and directly support community organizations that were working to address disparities in vaccine access and uptake among populations at heightened risk of transmission or serious illness, helping to reach a wider range of marginalized communities than the city government was able to reach on its own. We've also been really excited to partner with our local government on projects around cash assistance and guaranteed income, which I think are some of the best ways to equitably strengthen the social safety net if they're done well, as my fellow panelists have been talking about. So many of the issues we see in Baltimore, including crime, trauma, drug dependency, and homelessness, are driven by poverty and lack of economic opportunity. But poverty is a policy choice, and the simplest solution to address poverty is to help people financially. Studies have shown that even limited term cash payments, ideally without strings attached, can have transformative impacts on individuals and families living in poverty. That's why we partnered with our local city government to leverage $6 million in public funding to distribute prepaid cash cards to 15,000 city residents who are hardest hit by COVID-19 and its economic impact. And more recently, we've been advising and assisting with the city's guaranteed income pilot program, which is providing 2 years of unconditional, no strings attached, $1,000 per month payments to 200 young parents and families. Guaranteed income programs like this have been implemented and studied in dozens of other jurisdictions, and the results are really stunning. Even time-limited guaranteed income can lift people out of poverty long-term by doing things like allowing people to buy a car so they don't have to rely on inconsistent public transportation, maybe being able to access a higher paying job, or allowing them to save to afford a down payment on a house so that they can build equity over time, or pay down high interest debt to escape the cycle of poverty that's often otherwise impossible to get out of. Studies have demonstrated that guaranteed income with kind of no strings attached, with all the extra barriers and eligibility kind of prohibitions, result in better access to healthy food, more basic needs being met, a decrease in stress, improved financial stability, a range of improved health outcomes, an increase in community cohesion, and no increase in substance use. People don't need to have their spending monitored and controlled to prevent them from buying alcohol and drugs. Overwhelmingly, studies have shown that guaranteed income recipients spend their money on meeting basic needs and improving their health and well-being. One other thing, kind of briefly, that I wanted to say is that in addition to supporting groups that are providing direct services to fill unmet needs, another way that funders can tackle this issue is by supporting groups that are advocating for policy change. There's many examples of policies, many of which we've already heard, that are meant to help create a safety net, but have flaws that end up leaving many people behind or even harming the people those benefits are trying to help. You know, this can range from unnecessary work requirements that are burdensome and time consuming to financial assistance that's earmarked only for certain goods, or eligibility requirements that are overly restrictive or cut off your benefits if you make more than a pittance in pay. These are policies that focus so much on monitoring and control that they often work to keep people in poverty rather than supporting economic mobility. So one way that funders can make the safety net more equitable is to support organizations and coalitions working to remove these unnecessary restrictions on public benefits in order to make public welfare programs more accessible, less time consuming to navigate, and more likely to succeed at actually lifting people out of poverty. Our public system should be serving the community, not monitoring and controlling them. And this also extends, of course, to criminalization, because jails and prisons are an intentionally designed part of our social safety net, even if we don't like to think of them that way. We've made the choice as a society to spend our time and energy criminalizing and incarcerating people instead of helping them to meet their basic needs around income, education, and healthcare. We respond to homelessness, to drug use, and to trauma and mental health crises all too often by locking people up, taking them off the street and out of our communities, separating them from their families, rather than asking them what they need and then working to meet those needs. So a key part of this notion of equitably strengthening the safety net is looking at whom the safety net is serving and who it's locking up, and then working to transform it to serve more people so that there's no need to lock them up. As kind of one final example of our work in this area, we've been supporting the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland, which is a coalition of community organizations and individuals working to reduce unnecessary criminalization of our youth, of people living in poverty, of people who use drugs or who are engaged in survival sex work, and others who continue to be targeted and marginalized by local and state laws on the basis of their race, gender, disability, or social status. So if you're looking for something to get involved with, you can go to decrimmaryland.org to learn more about the People's Commission and see how you might be able to get involved. I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Michael. I think you bring up a really good point. Just like the criminal system, this system, as Ife indicated, was intentionally created to keep people in the situations that they're looking for help to get out of. And so I open this up to all of the panelists. What is it that really needs to happen to make these programs actually empower individuals, help them support their families, as opposed to keeping them on this cycle of needing assistance, not being able to support their families in the way that they see fit.
Well, this may seem like a bit of an indirect answer, but I think largely in part it is a direct, in my opinion, solution to what we really need if we want these systems to work and these programs to work effectively in terms of empowerment. Then we need to actually give more opportunities to marginalized communities, such as the options that Michael talked about with philanthropy. We need to give dollars back into Black and Brown communities, into folks who are disabled, into queer folks, into all these communities. When we give people the money and the resource, they know what to do with it. There's still a very top-down mentality when it comes to grant funding in this city and across the country that suggests that, you know, we have to have all these barriers and folks have to have a certain language and diction in order to receive grants. And in actuality, people know what they need in their communities and in their families. So give them the resource. The great example that was brought up with the mayor's office and young families getting that $1,000 payment a month, right? We need more examples of that, because thinking that we know or have the tools to be able to empower someone when someone is able to empower themselves. And so that's one thing. I think another thing is we have to think a little bit more broadly than just the social safety net. I think there also has to be a discussion about what type of entrepreneurial and job opportunities are we actually offering, so that people do not have to supplement their already low existing incomes. Because again, the majority of people on welfare have at least 2 streams of income. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they have 2 jobs. That could be a babysitting job and a low wage paying job, and they're still unable to make ends meet, and they're still needing public assistance. So I think the question isn't so much of just having that social safety net, but why don't we have more jobs that are available to folks who may or may not go to college or have a particular trade, but who have immense talent and incredible expertise to be able to offer, so that they can have one well-paying job that helps them to take care of their family's expenses and to be autonomous and independent. And that the social safety net is just that it is something that is used for emergencies and in moments of crises, and not for something in moments of survival and thriving. I think if we want to move to a conversation from surviving to thriving, then we need to look at structure and implementing systems in place, such as educational training programs. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about is, why don't we have mentorship programs set up directly with Department of Social Services and with public assistance agencies for folks who may have gone through public assistance, who've had it, who've now actually done well for themselves, and who can give assistance in terms of mentorship, internships, and even job employment to folks who are actually receiving the benefit. I think there are a lot of ways that we can, again, begin to really humanize the system. And if we want to empower, let's give people the tools because they already know what they need to do that.
Thank you, Charnel. Any other comments from the panel? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, one, just really quickly, I won't take too much time here, but I think what I feel like all of us mentioned in our own ways is it's about this idea of trust, right? And that if you trust people, they know how to take care of themselves. It is these stories that we have told about certain people that have masqueraded as fact, that we can't trust certain people, and therefore we need these controls. But I think, as Charnel alluded to, these controls are serving a larger systemic structure, right? A capitalistic structure that gives, economic gains to a few, but ensuring that the majority have very little, right? Fighting over scraps. So there's a lot of, I think, anti-racist work, anti-oppression work that also has to happen to kind of get to that level of trust, right? But I would say that is one of the fundamental pieces. And then, and developing that trust has to come. It doesn't come from me, who's a policy analyst, right? That doesn't come from me. I can shoot you data and all that. It comes from people who are in community, working with community, and the community members themselves. And when we trust them, we find policy solutions so that they work for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just, yeah, to echo all that, also this, like, just really, I don't know how you do it, but because it's like our system is built off this notion that people are either deserving or undeserving, right? And that's, all of the history that Ife mentioned so concisely in the beginning, like, as I'm listening, it's like every single policy that still operates today in our social services system can be linked or traced to that history. And so, the parents I work with are constantly saying, like, I have to jump through so many hoops just to get, what Erica mentioned, like $500 a month, which, when you break it down, isn't even going to be minimum wage for the amount that you're working. So just, the system operates that only people who are deserving should get these benefits, which we know that is totally based in, these racist myths and assumptions about deserving and undeserving. So I think until we just acknowledge that, people need cash to survive, and we do away with all the strings that are attached. We saw in the pandemic when we were like, oh, we're in a public health crisis. Let's figure out ways to roll out cash assistance to people as quickly as possible. The ways they did that: economic impact payments, putting waivers on some of these requirements, like, annual redeterminations or in-person interviews, giving a little bit of an extra benefit on top of the maximum. So, poverty is a public health crisis, right? Homelessness is a public health crisis. Like, we need to be treating racism, poverty, homelessness with the same level of urgency that we did at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, it is hard to imagine kind of how we have an equitable system without really addressing what's kind of guiding all of the policies and preventing people from accessing the benefits that exist.
Any
I wanted
additional-
to just, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one more quick thing. I know that the social services for disability, Social Security, disability income, and that governmental agency has a really great program called the PASS program. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with it, but it's a sort of independent, if you're receiving a Social Security disability income or SSI, Social Security income benefit, and you are want to work towards building your own business, they actually help you with creating an independence plan and a business plan and give you necessary supports to be able to still receive your benefit while you're building your business. And I brought that up just to say that we do have examples in other countries, and we even have examples in some of our agencies currently that really push towards autonomy, independence, and full development of the individual to be able to be fully free of needing to have these menial payments, right? But doing so in a way that allows them to still receive support in the meantime. So I just wanted to bring attention to that and say that we could actually take a cue from the SSI, SSDI system in that past program as one potential way that we could say, again, why aren't we allowing folks to get temporary cash assistance and getting classes on becoming an entrepreneur and starting their own LLCs, and providing those resources for them at the same time. Both can be happening together so that folks can be fully autonomous and independent.
I think we have time for one question from the chat. one of the things, we are entering into, actually tomorrow is the election day. What is it that we need to look out for in order to really hold those that are seeking to represent us? What do we need to look for to show that they have accountability in these areas? Open it to anybody in the panel.
I was trying to lean out and make sure others, I'm stepping in, so I'm gonna give it one more second in case somebody wants to jump in.
Go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, so I say that I'm kind of sighing because I've recently had some conversations with lawmakers that make me a little depressed. But I think what we need from lawmakers, first, one, those who are committed to democracy. Can I just say that very clearly, right? We need people who are defending people's rights, making sure that folks can vote and have different methods to vote. So first, standing up and promoting democracy, because I feel like I have to say that now, unfortunately, because of the times that we're living in. But also, one of the things that I have to remind myself is that legislators are people and don't know everything, right? And that they are actually looking to learn and hear from different people in order to make, effective policy decisions. And I think legislators need to in terms of prioritizing who they're hearing from, it should be from, their constituents, and particularly the voters who elected them. There have just been examples, again, I'm no longer in Maryland, but that I have seen in Georgia of them shutting out actual people who elected them, right, from the political process. And instead having private closed door meetings with well-connected officials representing business or certain interests. And so I think really what we need from legislators is to go back to really thinking about voters and all voters, right? Not just the ones who voted for you, but those who didn't, and really listening to those stories, those who are not able to vote as well because they still live in the state, right? And so really kind of going back to community. I feel like that's just really kind of a major piece for me. That's really that policy making, the policy making process needs to create space for those who are most impacted by said policy, whatever it is, into that process, and that those decisions should not be made without the individuals who are impacted the most. So in the case of the safety net, that would mean folks like Erica, who is a mother and an advocate and who has experienced the system, making sure that she is reaching people in power. So I think the types of candidates across any political spectrum, really should be those who are really committed to listening to community members and not prioritizing special interests and those who are the big donors, right? So we can have whole conversations about, campaign reform and et cetera, and I know that leads into it, but in terms of the types of policymakers, I think it's those who are committed to a this fundamental democratic process.
We are unfortunately at the end of this fantastic dialogue. I want to thank all of the panelists. I definitely have been enlightened and informed. I think also inspired by your advocacy and by your knowledge. And I hope the rest of the participants feel that as well. I think some of the themes that we have heard are empowerment, community, understanding the structural racism behind the policies that exist today. And so with that knowledge, we are all now in a position, one, to learn more, as well as to use our own voices for transformational change, not just for a more equitable social safety net, but for a more equitable society in all policies, so that these types of programs can be just that, emergency assistance. But for the most part, everyone should have access to, as Charnel said, thriving instead of just surviving. So I appreciate that you have joined us. I thank you. And we will be able to provide you with additional information. Stay tuned for the follow-up from this presentation. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe and have a wonderful rest of the summer. Bye-bye.